The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 5, verses 13 to 20. Ye are the salt of the earth. But if the salt have lost his savour, wherewith shall it be salted? It is thenceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out, and to be trodden under foot of men. Ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works, and glorify your Father which is in heaven. Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled. Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments, and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say unto you, that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. There endeth our reading. Thank you, Lord. Amen. In this second reading from chapter 5 of Matthew, we continue with the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is delivering this sermon on a hill outside of Capernaum by the Sea of Galilee to a crowd of followers and disciples. In yesterday's reading, we saw the beginning of the sermon where Jesus delivered the Beatitudes. And now in today's reading, there are three themes that Jesus delivers. And we can summarize them as salt, light, and the law. So regarding salt, Jesus says to this crowd of followers and disciples in verse 13, "Ye are the salt of the earth." And what we think that he means there is thinking of salt as the great preservative, which stops things going rotten. So to maintain wholesomeness requires salt, both in food and then in this metaphor that without the gospel, the world, the societies of the world will degenerate. And remember, Jesus is giving the sermon in a time of tremendous cruelty and oppression in the Holy Land, under the Roman Empire, but also under a very cruel Herodian dynasty. And the people are crying out for freedom and for some form of honor within the people that govern them. So the time is ripe for both political as well as religious revolution. So he's saying to these people who are brave enough to listen to his sermon and to challenge the orthodoxy, you are the salt of the earth. You have the potential to preserve the good things on earth and to stop them becoming rotten and corrupt. But then he says that if the salt has lost its savour, it can't be re-salted, and it's good for nothing then, and is cast out and trodden underfoot. And so this quality of being able to preserve is very precious, and once it's lost, it can't be regained. So I think he's really emphasizing here the tenuousness of the situation, that the people that are following him have to be very determined and have to hold on very tight to their faith in the gospel, because once they let go, it's very, very hard to come back. And indeed, if these disciples, and Jesus will know this, that after he is gone, if the disciples are not able to be determined, the gospel will die away, because it has to be carried forward by men and women. Jesus will no longer be on earth. In verse 14, he continues, and instead of using the metaphor of salt as a preservative, slowing down or stopping corruption, he now uses the metaphor of light. Light that can make things of darkness visible, provide clarity, provide warmth, provide goodness, provide life. Ye are the light of the world. What a inspiring and wonderful idea. And he's talking now about the fact that things need to be visible. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. So they're on a hill, and he's using the city here as a metaphor for this community that is being built around Christ. It cannot and should not be hidden. Once you have that light, you have to provide it for everyone. You don't light a candle and then place it under a container. A bushel would be a container for storing foods in those days. When you light a candle, you place it on a candlestick and it lights up all the house. And he says, let your light shine before men. So a follower of Christ mustn't hide their belief, mustn't deny their belief. In those times of tremendous danger for the nascent Christian community, and even today, where in some parts of the world, possibly even including the United Kingdom where I live, Christianity is under some significant threat. Let your light so shine before men. So the light that you bring metaphorically as a Christian, speaking about the gospel, place that on a candlestick and light up the house so that people can see the light. And notice how Christ here says, can see your good works. And I think this is interesting. This is really that the behavior and the actions of a Christian are more important than the things that they say. And it's by the deeds, helping others, loving others, denying oneself if possible, those good works will be very visible to people and will get them thinking. And through those good works, allow people to glorify God. So two very powerful metaphors, and we see those metaphors in the other Gospels, although not always included in a sermon, so to speak. Now, we come to the next 4 verses of this reading, and this is more complicated now, and I've been reading a lot of commentaries about these verses, and as is often the case, there's quite a diversity of opinion, and probably my own view is somewhat, I would say, a minority view amongst that spectrum of opinions. But let's just have a look at the verses first. Jesus says, despite the fact, so I'm paraphrasing here, despite the fact that I'm speaking with authority and healing and appear as a great prophet to you, so that's sort of implicit. He's not saying that, but that's implicit. But then he's saying, think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. This revolution is not a revolution in which the Jewish faith is overturned. And in the Gospel of Mark, we've gone through the many confrontations and disputations that Christ had with the religious leadership of that time within the Jewish community, the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees, and very, very sharp language and very, very tough confrontation. But the point that Jesus always made was that the religious leadership and the religious culture had drifted away from the true nature of God. And that's what Jesus is essentially saying here, that he's not wiping the slate clean and starting again, but he's fulfilling the original purpose. But there are complications here with how to interpret some of the things that come next. So he says, truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law. So in other words, for all time until the end, not one minutiae of the law should fall. And to understand this statement in the context of many of the other things that Christ says and does requires us to think very carefully, what does Christ actually mean when he refers to the law? Because he's obviously not referring to the multitude of Jewish customs, because as we know in all the Gospels, he and his disciples are often criticized for breaking those customs, doing certain actions on the Sabbath day, not washing hands before eating, spending time with Gentiles, and so on and so forth. So I think it's fairly clear, given that, and that Jesus always defends himself and his disciples very ably when challenged by the religious leadership about these, let's say, minor infringements of the Jewish law. Jesus cannot be referring to that totality when he talks about the law. And my best understanding of this, and perhaps my only understanding of this, is that actually Jesus here, by referring to the law, is referring to the 10 Commandments, which are the heart, really, of the Jewish pact with God to follow the 10 Commandments. And so many of those are well known to us in terms of our actions. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's possessions, and so on. So high ethical standards for behaviour, but also commandments involving worshipping God, not worshipping other gods, not worshipping false idols, honouring one's parents. So these are these core aspects of the compact made between Moses, representing the Jewish people, and God. And I think here, in terms of the law, Jesus is referring to the 10 Commandments. And so he's really saying that those 10 Commandments stand. But as we shall see in the readings of the coming days, as we go through this sermon, Jesus has a very I would say, revolutionary approach to the interpretation and the living up to those commandments, which really bring to the center stage the true meaning of them, not just the fact that these may be somehow laws, but these are actually incredibly high aspirations for how to live. And a Christian, in principle, or can aspire to this very elevated form of living. And I'm using these caveats like in principle or can aspire to, because I never want to give the impression that somehow Christians have an entitlement or a natural propensity to act in ways that are better than others, because we know that's often not the case. And we also know that Christians are human beings, and human beings are imperfect. So I hope that the listeners can understand that I place those caveats always so as to be as inclusive as possible, and not to ever draw a ring around Christians as somehow a special group. Far from it. There will be good, bad, and indifferent amongst every group, including Christians. But Christ has provided us with the map and the language for us to use in our hearts on how to live better. And it's a very, very high bar, and we will come to those aspects in the coming days. So continuing here then, in verse 19, Jesus says that whoever breaks one of these commandments or teaches men to break them shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. Interesting that in breaking or teaching men to break one of the minor commandments is not seen as an unredeemable act, so the kingdom of heaven is still attainable, possibly, but in doing such an action to teach that the commandments can be broken, that person will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But who does teach them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And here Jesus now starts to raise the bar, because he says, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the Jewish religious hierarchy, the elite, the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not even enter the kingdom of heaven. And there's perhaps a slightly sly implicit inference there, or implication there, that the scribes and Pharisees actually do not have a righteousness that would allow them to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Now, of course, as we know from the Gospel of Mark, and as we'll see through the Gospel of Matthew, the main criticism that Jesus has of the religious elite, or the people representing Judaism at that time, was that they had lost touch with the heart of the religious endeavor, the relationship with God, and were focusing too much on ritual and too much on the details of other laws, let's say, beyond the Ten Commandments. And in doing so, were actually creating a lot of harm, particularly for people who were vulnerable. Jesus always leads with love and compassion. His eye will always be most firmly focused on the vulnerable, and so this would have caused him tremendous pain, and hence his harsh criticism of the people who, if they were conducting their role properly, would be acting in a Christian manner. So some difficult verses here in the latter half of this reading, because again it is somewhat of a collision between the Gospel and the Old Testament. And I've spoken at some length about this recently when speaking of Deuteronomy, and I gave quite a long recording there of my view of some aspects of Deuteronomy that I find to be incompatible, absolutely incompatible with the Christian faith. And in these verses, it's a great challenge to someone like me who has the temerity to say that, because Christ is essentially saying, not one jot or tittle of the law will fall. And for very traditional Christians who would have the view that every word of the Old Testament is sacrosanct, then they would look to these verses for justification for their view, and I think it would be a very sensible place for them to look for that justification. However, my understanding as someone who believes that the New Testament is truly a revolution in understanding, I believe that here, in terms of the law, Jesus is referring essentially solely to the Ten Commandments. And with that, we will be moving on tomorrow with more installments from this wonderful Sermon on the Mount.